Good afternoon, and welcome to the second section of the Appalachian Author Series. My name is Susan Poole, and I'm the director of the College for Seniors here at the North Carolina Center for Creative Retirement, soon to be the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UNC Asheville. The center was founded in 1988 with a mission to provide opportunities to thrive in life's second half through learning, leadership, service, and research. As of August the 1st, we will become officially the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and receive a $2 million grant from the Bernard Osher Foundation, which has funded over 120 lifelong learning institutes across the country. We will continue all the wonderful programming that we currently offer, including the College for Seniors classes, where our Appalachian Studies program first began 3 years ago. Our new stream of funding from the Osher Foundation, from the Osher Endowment, however, will allow us to offer programming like the Appalachian Authors Series, one of the projects that was first funded by our first $100,000 grant from the Osher Foundation. I would particularly like to thank Doug Agor, Sandra Brown, Wilma Durko, Catherine Wilson, Carol Taylor, Teresa Sigmund, Susan Snyder, Margaret Jeffries, Nancy Mathewson, Susan Grable, Charlotte Moore, and Tom Sanders, who worked throughout the year to bring us programming like the Appalachian Sampler and other Appalachian Studies courses that we will be offered again this year. Please, if I've called your name, stand up so we can thank you all. This programming focuses on the geology and geography, the arts and crafts, the music and literature of the Appalachian region. In addition to this particular focus on Appalachian Studies, we are offering almost 100 courses in the College for Seniors fall lineup this year. Everything from art crimes to Zumba for seniors. We focus on learning for the love of it and offer our members many ways to keep minds and bodies active and to become part of a community of people who have diverse interests but share a keen sense of intellectual curiosity. If you are a visitor, we hope that your trip to the center today will give you a taste of the kinds of stimulating programming that we offer throughout the year. It is with particular pleasure that I welcome today's authors, Charles Frazier, who has introduced the rich culture of our mountains to the rest of the world, and Thomas Crowe. Charles Frazier was born in Asheville and grew up in western North Carolina. In 1997, his first novel, Cold Mountain, won the National Book Award, the Hartman Award from the Chicago Tribune, the Thomas Wolfe Literary Award, and the Sue Kaufman Prize for First Fiction from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. It was adapted to the screen in 2003 Academy Award-winning film of the same name. Music from the film inspired several musical CDs as well as an opera written by Pulitzer Prize for Music winner Jennifer Higdon for the Santa Fe and Philadelphia operas. His 2006 book, 13 Moons, garnered the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance Award and was the first major work of fiction to be translated from English into the Cherokee language. The movie rights to his third novel, Nightwoods, published in 2011, have already been acquired. In 2008, the governor awarded Charles the North Carolina Award, which is the highest civilian honor given by the state. He has also been inducted into the Fellowship of Southern Authors. Charles is about to start work on his fourth novel. I would also like to introduce another Appalachian author who has contributed so much to preserving the environment and traditions of our area, Thomas Crowe. Thomas Crowe is an internationally published poet and the author of 30 books of original and translated works. He was a founding editor of Gadua Journal, a bioregional journal of the Southern Appalachians, which has been called the best bioregional publication in the United States. He is also founder and publisher of the New Native Press. His multi-award-winning memoir, Sorrow's Field, My Life in the Appalachian Woods, was based on 4 years of self-sufficient living in a wilderness environment in the woods of western North Carolina. As a regional and community activist since 1979, he has been involved with such issues and organizations as the Canary Coalition for Clean Air, the Project to Protect Native American Sacred Sites in the Southern Appalachians, and has been on the board of the Southern Biodiversity Project and the Environmental Leadership Council for Western North Carolina. His most recent book of essays and articles is entitled The End of Eden, Writings of an Environmental Activist. Respectfully, I would ask that if you have questions, please wait until after Thomas and Charles are finished. Please welcome Charles Frazier and Thomas Crowe.
Well, Charles, where do you want to start? First of all, can you hear us?
Yeah. No. How about that? Yeah, mine says on.
Is this? Hello? No?
No? All right. Anybody, did that make a difference? No.
Can I give you guys a handheld?
Sure.
It's always this way.
Apologies.
Okay, I was just asking Charles where he wanted to start. So I'm going to put him on the hot seat.
Oh, and I had an idea on that. Thomas and I are almost exactly the same age. And I grew up in Andrews. I was born here in Asheville, grew up in Andrews. Thomas grew up in Robbinsville. And I thought we might talk a little bit about that, the business of growing up in the Southern Appalachians and then going out into the world, what paths led us to be writers and what led us back.
That was pretty tricky. How he handled that. Well, I grew up as a boy over in Graham County in Robbinsville. For those of you who know the area, know these mountains, know that Graham County is a very remote part of the western part of the state. 50 years ago or more, it was even more remote than it is now. I can remember we didn't have television, we didn't have radio signals. I can remember getting the first telephone service, the crank telephones. It was living kind of, I look on it now and think of it as living in, what's the place in Scotland that disappears every 100 years? Brigadoon. Especially when I go back, it's really like going back into a time warp and almost another planet, because things haven't really changed that much. But it was very much an oral culture. At least 50% of my friends were Cherokee, snowbird Cherokees. At that time, there was an Indian school on the Snowbird Reservation over on Big Snowbird. So I played a lot with the native boys and girls. We ran barefoot through the woods, but everything was oral. My mother used to sing to me and to tell me stories at night before I went to bed, and that went on until I was pretty near in high school, until my father put an end to it. He thought I was becoming a little bit too sissified, I think. But that's what got me started. It was listening to people telling stories. It was people playing music. live music, and my mother, as I say, reading to me and reciting and singing old Scottish songs at night that really got me started. I can remember how listening to her recite poems, I could see the images in my mind. It was like I was listening. It was an auditory experience, but my experience of the words, of the sounds, were that it was like a screen in my mind. I could see the pictures. This was before I'd ever seen television. So it was a visual experience for me, and it was like magic. And I've always related to literature and the arts in that way. It's like magic, that these things come out of wherever they come from and present themselves either visually or tangentially or on the page as words. It's always a mystery and always magic. But to think, when I think back, to think that someone like myself was a very physical person, and that my parents would probably say was a little bit overactive. They've got words for that these days. To become a writer is a mystery to me. I probably would have been much better off doing something very, very physical and tactile. But here we are, and we're both doing this kind of isolated, reclusive scribbling stuff that we do. And oddly enough, we both ended up back here in our home place and are writing about it and doing different things to become more a part of the place.
Yeah, that comment about the oral nature of storytelling, when we were both growing up back there in that far tip of the state, is something that, writing Cold Mountain, I was trying to learn how to write a book, because I didn't take creative writing classes in college or anything like that. And it was a matter of all those little details that I guess you pick up in an MFA program. I don't know what they do in those, but like narrative voice. Well, I had to kind of figure that out. And I remember when I began to think of the third person narrative voice in the book as not being the character's voice and not being my voice, as being the shadow character who's a storyteller, who's telling the story, that you're not getting Ada's thoughts and feelings directly unmediated, or Inman's. You're getting a storyteller telling you about it. And when I began to realize that some days I could hear that voice, and that those were the really good days of writing where I actually got something done, then I began to understand something about the way I can write. I don't know whether that applies to many other people or not, or what, but that oral character of narrative, that it's not a simple this or that, the author's voice, the character's voice, that there are these storyteller elements to it. I was not. When we grew up, did you ever know a writer?
No.
Yeah. The only writer I ever met was Richard Chase. How many of you know who Richard Chase was? He wrote that Jack Tales book, and he would come around to the schools. He and my father knew each other some. My father was a school principal and later superintendent. And so he would come to Andrews, Richard Chase, and do a program. And he would read his Jack Tales adaptations or the Grandfather Tales. And I think it was maybe my first sense of the power of stories, of fiction, to see him telling a story like Granny Manders or Skoonkin hunting, and little third grade boys from way out in the country would just be so delighted they couldn't stand it and would run into the aisles of the auditorium and dance. Not to music, to storytelling. I think that was my first exposure to a writer, to an actual published writer. And he also sometimes wore a beret and an eye patch, so he really looked like a writer.
Charles and I, prior to coming here this afternoon, we've been sitting around swapping stories and talking about our youth and growing up and some of the experiences we had. And we've found that we've had a lot of very similar experiences, if not the same experiences growing up. And growing up in a very isolated and remote part of the world, you know, you're forced to be creative. You're forced to be kind of a self-starter and to be imaginative just to get through the day. There's not a lot of stuff coming at you. You know, you've got to figure out what you're going to do and where you're going to go and how you're going to get in trouble that day, all by yourself. So we've been swapping these get in trouble stories and having a good time. One of the things that I like the most about Charles' books is that when he writes, he takes me back to that place. He writes about this area and he writes about those times, or maybe a little before, but it's a history and there are places that I know, and for the most part that I've been. In his book Nightwoods, I wrote a review when it came out, and I'll just give you an example of how similar our lives were. In Nightwoods, Charles, well, I'll just read this short paragraph. In what can only be called a dark trip down memory lane reminiscent of Tim Winton's Dirt Music, or Ron Rash's Serena, complete with rape, murder, incest, crime, and cursing, it might seem callous or insensitively strange to say that reading Nightwoods was fun, but it was. And it must have been fun for Charles Frazier to write as well, going back and dragging up the past of his mountain boyhood, just a ridgeline or two over from where I too was growing up at the same time. Reading his descriptions and references sent me straight back to my own boyhood. All the memorable 1950s and 60s references are there. Old Nash Ramblers, Cheerwine and Moon Pies, bootleggers, illegal bars in dry counties, summer vacations at Myrtle Beach, hand-cranked ice cream, no TV reception, 2 or 3 digit phone numbers, the Pied Piper, Jack and the Beanstalk, Royal Crown pomade, rabbit foot keychains, vast national forests, Hearst shifters and an 8-ball, drive-ins, dowsing sticks, Cherokee fish weirs, Indian trails marked with stone cairns and trail marker trees, swimming holes and swinging bridges, the stroll, fist fights and drunken brawls, butternick patterns, the usual afternoon temperature rainforest showers, radio stations you couldn't pick up until dark, the Ventures, Oldsmobile Rocket 88s, straight razors and thick oiled strops, histrionic hairdos. We all remember those. And that's basically the list of some of the things that I recognized, and it took me right back to my boyhood. And so the whole book was kind of like a time machine trip for me, going back into my own past, reading Charles's latest book.
Yeah, that was one of the differences in this one and the previous two, is not so much library research, more memory, more trying to pull back those little details that make a world and then set some characters in motion in that world. And then I would just have to go and check and make sure my memory was accurate, and sometimes it was and sometimes it wasn't. For those of you, if you haven't seen this book, let me just give you a little taste of it. The main character is this young woman named Luce, who has has, you don't know why, as the book begins, is living by herself as the caretaker of an old lake mountain lodge. And I was thinking of a place like Nantahala Lake or maybe Fontana Lake, but really more like if Nantahala Lake was bigger. And those old 19th century tourist lodges, and this one's hasn't been in operation for years and years. And she's kind of happy being by herself, living by herself, observing the change of seasons, all that. And then suddenly her sister's murdered down in Raleigh, and her two children are brought up for Luce to take care of because she's the only relative left. So this is the beginning. Luce's new stranger children were small and beautiful and violent. She learned early that it wasn't smart to leave them unattended in the yard with the chickens. Later she'd find Feathers, a scaled yellow foot with its toes clenched. Neither child displayed language at all, but the girl glared murderous expressions at her if she dared ask where the rest of the rooster went. The children loved fire above all elements of creation. A heap of dry combustibles delighted them beyond reason. Luce began hiding the kitchen matches, except the few she kept in the hip pocket of her jeans for lighting the stove. Within 2 days, the children learned how to make their own fire from tinder and a green stick bowed with a shoelace. Tiny cavemen on Benzedrine couldn't have made fire faster. Then they set the back corner of the lodge alight, and Luce had to run back and forth from the spring with sloshing tin buckets to put it out. She switched them both equally with a thin willow twig until their legs were striped pink, and it became clear that they would draw whatever pain came to them down deep inside and refuse to cry, at which point Luce swore to herself she would never strike them again. She went to the kitchen and began making a guilty peach pie. Luce was not much maternal. The state put the children on her. If she had not agreed to take them, they would have been separated and adopted out like puppies. By the time they were grown, they wouldn't even remember each other. Though, now that it was probably too late to go back, maybe that would have been a good thing. Separate them and dilute whatever weirdness they shared and ignited between them. Yet more proof, as if you needed it, that the world would be a better place if every damn body didn't feel some deep need to reproduce. But God in his infinite wisdom had apparently thought it was an entertaining idea for us to always be wanting to get up in one another. So it goes on from there.
It's a romance book, right? Well, since we're on the subject, a high school teacher over at Smoky Mountain High School in Jackson County, where I live, finished reading Charles's novel and wrote an email to me telling me of her reaction of the book. She's fifth generation Scotch-Irish from Jackson County and knows the place and knows the language, knows the history and culture very, very well, and embodies it in a lot of ways. So there was a lot of things in the book that really hit home for her, and she writes in the email, she says, "I think Night Woods is a good read for anyone, but it's especially meaningful if you're aware of place as well. I've always wanted one of those little Nash Metropolitans." One of my favorite things in the book was when Charles Frazier described the landscape as being covered with a skift of snow. Mrs. Queen always said that. Mrs. Queen is legendary over in Jackson County where I live, is an old mountain balladeer and cultural historian. Miss Queen always said that. I have never met Charles Frazier, but I think the reviewer was right when he described him as one of our literary heroes. I certainly admire him and his skill. His attention to detail and his descriptions are what sets him apart. I'll never forget when Inman first sees the mountains and the way he describes it. If he left that out, it would be like reading Steinbeck with no description. So it's all in the details, and maybe we can talk a little bit about where our images, where our stories, where the details come from in terms of the things that we write about.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, and this is the place I am right now on a new project, is, my God, you've got to fill up all those pages with something. And where that stuff comes from is sort of a mystery, and it's also sort of practical. And I've got a little bit marked to read from 13 Moons that illustrates the process some. When I was early on in writing this book, that has a lot to do with the removal of the Cherokee, and not just the removal, but how the Cherokee who stayed here were able to stay, what that process was, because I didn't really understand it. And I was curious, how did my ancestors come in and pretty much take everything, but how did that one little group stay? So I'd gone over one day to Western Carolina to the special collections to look at William Holland Thomas material. And a wonderful librarian named George Frazier brought me out this big stack of stuff, all this stuff. I asked for like 2 things, and he brought out a cart full of William Holland Thomas material. And after I'd been there for about 3 days, he said, you know, there's this story about William Holland Thomas when he was really old, that he had a railroad going right in front of his house, and that he hated it, and that he would go out and shoot his shotgun from his front porch at the train. But he said, but you can't use that, of course, because it's probably not true. And so here's the conclusion of 13 Moons. At this point, William Holland Thomas, named Will Cooper in this book, not exactly the same character, but a lot of the same DNA. He's made a bunch of money on railroad stock. He always wanted a railroad to come to Western North Carolina and bring progress, and now he sits on his front porch and watches the flat cars full of enormous logs being logged out of what's now the Smoky Mountain National Park area come by his house. I cocked my head to aim an ear toward the first low-pitched rumble from upriver. I put the book down and take up the Parker. That's a type of shotgun. At this moment on the train, Pullman porters in white jackets walk the aisles much the way they do before reaching long tunnels cored through the mountains. For the tunnels, the porters lift the yellow flames of candles to touch the charred wicks of kerosene lanterns swinging from the ceilings, and they warn passengers not to be alarmed by the sudden onset of darkness. As they approach my house, the porters go through the passenger car's lowering windows on the side exposed to my front porch, and they tell the tourists that the sound of a discharging firearm should not cause concern. It's a deal I have struck. I promise to use loads no greater than birdshot, and the railroad administrators and the local sheriff promise to ignore me. I rise and stand and carry the Parker to the porch rail when the locomotive approaches and the engineer blows the whistle and waves. The armatures to the drive wheels pump relentlessly. I put the padded cup of the gun butt to my shoulder and aim rather generally. I trip one trigger, the kick steps me back. I brace myself and fire the second barrel. The forlorn echoes are nearly lost in the clamor of the train, and if the birdshot even carries as far as the tracks, it rattles off the car windows like the first hard pellets of rain at the front edge of a thunderstorm. It is partly my railroad, and fine birdshot is harmless against metal and glass. The whistle blows 2 short, friendly notes, and the locomotive turns the curve and drags its train behind. In the end, just a fading rumble coming from down the river and black smoke settling over everything before the mountains form up again, shorn and damaged and eternal. So that whole conclusion of the book came from George saying, there's this rumor and you can't use it. And I just kept that in my mind for 3 years and decided to use it. The Parker shotgun was my grandfather's shotgun. The story, the little detail of the porters lighting kerosene lanterns as they go through tunnels was my grandfather's story when he was a little tiny boy shortly after the very beginning of the 20th century. He said one of his earliest memories was riding the train from somewhere around Murphy or Hayesville to Haywood County, and the thing that struck him the most was that lighting the candles and then going into the tunnels that are, I guess, near Nantahala Gorge. So all of those little memories, details, research, all that stuff just kind of needs to, sort of work in your imagination and find a form that relates to the story and the character and the place. Because I'm really, if there's a meaning to what I write, it arises out of people and places and events, not ideas that I impose on a story.
And here's my version. It's taken from a feature article, a cover article that I did for the Smoky Mountain News on 3 of the writers in Western North Carolina that I consider the most important, that are people writing about this place and its history. It would be Charles, and it would be Wayne Caldwell and Ron Rash. And they did this big feature piece that I wrote, and I'm writing about 13 Moons. And I say, I recall Charles Frazier telling me one evening in the Captain's Bookshelf in Asheville that his second novel, 13 Moons, set over in Swain and Jackson counties and published in 2006, came from a supposedly true story. Now we know it's not. He had heard about Will Thomas. The model for the book's central character of Will Cooper is the historically real person of Will Thomas, who was once upon a time chief of the Cherokee Eastern Band. They say Will Thomas used to sit on his front porch over near Whittier and take pot shots at tourists as they rode by on the train. Well, I have to say I've read a lot of fiction, but that ending is the best ending I have ever read. It's my favorite. It's my favorite ending, probably because I know the place so well and because the story rings true to me, knowing the historical characters and the places that the story was set in. After 13 Moons came out, I have a farmer friend over in Whittier named William Shelton, who farms the bottomland right along the area where Will Thomas's house was in the train tracks go by. So William and I got in his pickup truck one day, and we rode around Swain County and the Qualla boundary, trying to find all these places in Charles' book. And of course, William Shelton knew where Will Thomas's house was, and we stopped there. And you could literally throw a stone from the front porch of Will Thomas's house to the railroad tracks. So he must have been a pretty bad shot. But that's my side of the story. In terms of where I get my images and my references, a lot of it's very similar to what Charles was explaining. They kind of appear mostly unexpectedly. I started out, as I said, my mother reading to me at night when I was real young, and what I really identified most strongly with was poetry. It was unattainable, I thought, in terms of anything that I could create, but it was what really, really impressed me. And I grew up as a young boy and then as a teenager wanting to be a poet, imagining if of all the things in the world that I could be, that's what I would choose, because it seemed the most unattainable and unreachable. But embodied the most magic of anything that I had experienced in my life. Of course, I hadn't fallen in love by that time, and that probably surpassed the magic of writing a poem at some point or another, but I decided that's really what I really wanted to do, if there was any one thing I was going to try and do. And it took me a while to get there. I was writing little poems of my own eventually, but never had anything published. I was never a serious poet. I'd never met any other writers or any poets. So I really didn't know what it meant to be a poet. So I graduated from college at Furman University in 1972 and immediately took off for France. I thought you had to be French to be a great poet. Go figure. I was young, what did I know? But I realized very quickly that I was never going to become a French poet. I was an American. I mean, I'm a slow learner, but I eventually get there. So what I did was I came back to America, and I went where I knew there were poets who I loved and respected. I went to San Francisco to be in proximity with my heroes, the beat poets. And as luck would have it, and as good timing would grace my life with, it was a time when the beat poets were kind of on the downslide. They'd had all their 15 minutes of fame in the 50s and early 60s, and there wasn't much going on in their world, but they were all hanging out in San Francisco in the cafes and bars and just craving attention. And here we are, a bunch of young writers from all over the country and the world that had gathered, around North Beach in San Francisco, and sitting at the feet of our heroes. And it worked both ways. They loved it. They loved all the attention, and we loved all the information and the education that we were getting. We called it at the time the University of the Streets, because all the classes were held in bars and cafes, and or in somebody's home or hotel room. And that's where I got my real education as a poet and a writer. And my heroes were usually the kind of poets that created something from nothing, brought things out of the air, from the imagination or from the beyond. And that's the way that I started writing, and the way that I still write today is I write from the subconscious. I let whatever it is that's there or out there come through me. So I kind of, my process is more as a conduit or a channel for what's brewing inside. And then usually the subject matter is something very real in the very real world, something I'll notice, something that'll get my attention. And in the last 25 years, it's been the mountains of western North Carolina. They got my attention when I was young. I just didn't know it. I had to go out and see the world and then come back to really understand that some of the greatest beauty and the most interesting people and cultures really are from here. And that's got my attention, and it's held it for over 25 years. And now most of my writing has to do with this place in one way or another.
Well, I got to tell a story that it sort of has to do with where your material comes from. This was several years before I met Thomas. What year did Zorro's Field come out? 2005. I was out on book tour for 13 Moons, and I was at the same place I am right now, not knowing what's next, and was reading this wonderful book. And I guess the short, simple, sort of dumb way to describe it is a modern day Thoreau. And so I kept reading it, and I kept thinking, this guy's good at this. He's successful at this. He knows how to do this stuff, this subsistence living. And I thought, what if you wanted to do that and set out to do it, and then were really bad at it? Temperamentally and just skill level and all of that. So I started writing these little sketches, and this character Stubblefield in Nightwoods got its origin from those early sketches. And little of it remained in the book because it just took a different direction. But I had this scene, one of the ones that I wrote, where, you know, here's this guy who wants to be Thoreau, wants to be a modern day Thoreau. He's got his cabin by a lake. He's trying to be self-sufficient. But damn, television is so entertaining. And so he just breaks down, and he's going to go up on the roof and put up a big old antenna and see if he can get a station from Asheville or Chattanooga or somewhere. And manages to fall off, slide down the roof, hit the ground, the antenna comes down on top of him, and he's lying there trying to catch his breath. And that's the thing that's left in the book, is him lying there looking up at the mountains, thinking about what the stories he hears in the barbershop about lovers, illicit lovers going up on the mountain to park. And all he can think is, all I've got in my life is listening to Miles Davis's Kind of Blue and getting sad. So just things come from all over, and you just have to kind of be open to all these things that arrive. And I'm not much of a note taker. I feel like if it's going to work, it's going to stick, and let it do that. Want to talk about Appalachian humor? We were going to do that?
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah? Because we were spending a lot of time at lunch just talking about things people said, things old timers said when we were kids that we still remember. And it's such a core part of the Southern Appalachian personality to me. And this came to mind partly when 13 Moons came out. There was the CBS Sunday Morning came to do a piece on it, and we went over to the Museum of the Cherokee that has a lot of Will Thomas's things, like his desk, for example. And so Kenny Blankenship, who's the director of the museum, was showing Rita Braver around. And so there's Will Thomas's desk, and here's some correspondence. And she was very serious and listening very carefully. And he said, you know, and Will Thomas, he had all these little stores all over western North Carolina in the Cherokee Territory, little trading posts and all that. And she was nodding, and he said, so, you know, and he had a name for those, that chain of stores. And she said, oh, really? He said, yeah, he called them Wilmarts. And there was like a 4-beat pause. And then she cracked up. And then Kenny turned to me and said, Appalachian humor. So I've got a little bit in Cold Mountain that expresses my sense of Appalachian humor. This is about Ada and her father Monroe, who've come up to the mountains from Charleston, and they look at mountaineers in the way that people from outside have frequently looked at mountaineers, as these benighted, ignorant people that need to be helped. Monroe's greatest debacle as missionary had come later that summer and involved Sally and Esco Swanger. A Mize man in the congregation had told Monroe that the Swangers were stunning in their ignorance. Esco, according to Mize, could scarcely read, in fact had never advanced in his understanding of history beyond the earliest doings of the deity in Genesis. The creation of light was about the last thing Esco had a firm grasp of. Sally Swanger, Mize had said, was somewhat less informed. They both saw the Bible only as a magic book and used it like a gypsy hand reader. They held it and let it fall open and then stabbed a finger at the page and tried to puzzle out the meaning of the word so indicated. It was deemed oracular, and they acted upon it as instructions straight from God's mind. If God said go, they went. He said abide, they stayed put. He said slay, Esco got the hatchet and went out looking for a pullet. They were, despite their ignorance, unavoidably prosperous, since their farm occupied a wide piece of cove bottom with dirt so black and rich it would raise sweet potatoes as long as your arm with only the least efforts toward keeping the weeds shaved back. They would make valuable members of the congregation if Monroe could only bring them up to date. So Monroe had gone visiting, Ada at his side. They'd sat together in the parlor. Esco humped forward as Monroe tried to engage him in a discussion of faith. But Esco gave up little of himself and his beliefs. Monroe found no evidence of religion other than a worship of animals and trees and rocks and weather. Esco was some old relic Celt, was what Monroe concluded. What few thoughts, What few thoughts Esco might have would more than likely be in Gaelic. Seizing such an opportunity, Monroe attempted to explain the high points of true religion. When they got to the Holy Trinity, Esco had perked up and said, 3 into 1, like a turkey foot. Then, in a while, convinced that Esco had indeed not yet got report of his culture's central narrative, Monroe told the story of Christ, from divine birth to bloody crucifixion. He included all the famous details, and while keeping it simple, he summoned all the eloquence he could. When he'd finished, he sat back, waiting for a reaction. Esco said, "And you say this took place some time ago?" Monroe said, 2,000 years, if you consider that some time ago. "Oh, I'd call that a stretch," Esco said. He looked at his hands where they hung from his wrists, flexed the fingers and looked at them critically as if trying the fittings of a new implement. He thought on the story a while and then said, "And what this fella come down for was to save us." "Yes," Monroe said. "From our own bad natures and the like." "Yes." "And they still done him like they did, spiked him up and knifed him and all." "Yes, indeed," Monroe said. "But," Esco said, "you say this story's been passed around some 100 years. "Nearly," Monroe said. "A long time." Esco grinned as if he had solved a puzzle and stood up and slapped Monroe on the shoulder and said, "Well, about all we can do is hope it ain't so." At home that night, Monroe had drawn up plans as to how he might best instruct Esco in proper doctrine and so save him from heathenism. It never entered Monroe's mind that he'd been made a butt of humor and that his quest for ignorance had been so apparent from the moment he had entered Esco's gate as to give grave offense. Nor, of course, did he suppose that instead of shutting the door in his face or pitching a pan of gray foot wash water at him or showing him the bore to his shotgun, as some so insulted would have done, Esco, a gentle soul, had simply taken pleasure in giving Monroe great quantities of the ignorance he came seeking. Esco bragged to no one about what he had done. In fact, he seemed not to care in the least whether or not Monroe ever knew the truth of the matter, which was that he and his wife, Sally, were dipped Baptists. It was Monroe that spread the tale by way of asking for the names of others so benighted. He found it odd that people took the story as humorous and that people sought him out at the store or on the road and asked him to tell it. They would wait for him to repeat Esco's final line, as most men like to do after the recitation of a successful joke. When Monroe failed to do it, some would say the line again themselves. This went on until Sally finally took pity and told Monroe the truth. But I think we both knew people, that old-timers especially, that that understood the stereotype of the mountaineer and would play to it and work the ignorance of the person who was assuming they were ignorant against them and really didn't care whether the person ever knew that they were being made fun of or not.
And I think you and I have experienced our share of that kind of discrimination over the years. I know I had, especially in terms of the language. My family moved around a good bit, and every time we moved, it seemed to be we were moving further north, further away from the southern Appalachian speech that I grew up talking, which is kind of a mixture of Chaucerian English and a little bit of Irish and Cherokee thrown in for good measure. But it is rich with metaphor and poetry, really, in a lot of ways. And so the further north that my family moved, the more I was forced to unlearn my original language, because people looked at me like I was stupid. Anybody that talks like that must be dumb. I mean, really. And so by the time I got to San Francisco, I was talking like a Yankee out of necessity. But Charles is right. We knew, you know, these wonderful characters and heard or experienced these wonderful stories. I've got one here in Zorro's Field. Zorro's Field is a book about my attempt to live my version of Walden Pond here in western North Carolina, and was able to hang with it for 4 years. And this is a story. There were most of the people that I related to or spent time with during those 4 years were the old mountain people, because those were the people that I could learn the most from. And trying to be self-sufficient and live without electricity or running water or any money is tough if you've never done it before. So you need teachers, and you need people who know how to do this kind of thing. And the old mountain people were the only people that could help me out when I got into a jam, or got between a rock and a hard place, as they would say. So this is a story from Zorro's Field about a real situation and a real person. It's something that actually happened to me. I went to college at Furman University, and I was spending a lot of time up in the mountains around Saluda, which is along the Green River, which is where I spent those 4 years that I eventually wrote about. Hanging out a lot with an old mountain man named Walt Johnson. And Walt Johnson was a true character, right out of Little Abner. I swear, if there ever was anybody that embodied the horrible stereotype of the Southern Appalachian mountain man, it was Walt Johnson. So this is a story about Walt Johnson and me back in the 1970s. Looking back on these first days at Johnson Pond, I can appreciate Walt for the character he was. I remember that at some point early on, I brought a lovely blonde girl whom I was dating at the time with me on one of my quick getaways to Saluda. No sooner had we driven into the yard that Walt had us inside the house, offering us a meal of cornbread, boiled potatoes, and black-eyed peas. As he dished up the plates for our late afternoon supper, he turned to me with a twinkle in his eye and asked me whether I'd ever eaten red okra. I hadn't, and I told him so, which sent him into the bedroom in the back of the house. He emerged holding what looked like dried red okra in his left hand. Here, he proclaimed, playing to his captive audience, holding the pods of okra up in the air for my young guest to see, is some of the best red okra you'll ever eat. I should have contemplated the slight smile peeking out from under his lips as he made his pronouncement, but I didn't, being more concerned with making a good impression on my friend. As he placed our plates of mountain gruel in front of us on the small, rough-hewn oak-top table in the room that tripled as dining room, kitchen, and parlor, he handed me one of the long, thin red pods, inviting me to take a big bite. Taking delight in my inexperience and lack of knowledge of Southern Appalachian cuisine, he smiled as I took the red pod from his extended hand and bit about 3 inches off the tip. 3 seconds later, I was on my feet and headed out the door toward the spring house. As I hit the yard, I could hear Walt laughing inside, my mouth ablaze from the heat of the hot pepper. In the spring house, my whole head went underwater as I struggled to extinguish the fire in my gullet. Feeling like the fool I was for having been suckered by such a prank, I went back to the house, where Walt was parading around the room and looking very proud of himself while making a mockery of me to my friend. "What do you think of a man who would eat a hot pepper thinking it was okra?" Embarrassed, I picked at my meal wondering what else he had slipped into the supper while I wasn't looking. My girlfriend seemed to enjoy Walt's little joke, which made the whole episode all the more demeaning. Even the dog seemed to have a wry grin on his baggy snout.
We could do that all day long. I love those old mountaineer pranks. Well, one of the things that I think that has informed both our work is this sense of the kind of interpenetration of the natural history and the human history of this place. We were talking earlier, we both spent some time out west. Thomas in California, I lived in Colorado for a while. And when I came back to North Carolina from Colorado, I thought all I wanted to write about was the West. But got back here and very quickly realized if I could write something that captured something about this place, the natural part and the human part, maybe that's a better thing for me to do than to, write about horses and ranchers in Colorado or Wyoming. And there's a bit in Night Woods that I think sort of sums up my feeling about that, because this is a place that's been inhabited and been fairly intensely inhabited for a long time. It's not it's not like parts of the West, and this was something I had to begin to really acknowledge and get a feel for to start writing. In this scene, Luce's kids have run away. They've been gone for a couple of nights at this point. The weather's been horrible. There's been snow, and she's been hunting nonstop for them in the woods. She knows they're out in the woods, out in. I thought of a kind of like if you started up Mount Pisgah, you were going up one of those 6,000-foot mountains in western North Carolina. These kids have headed up that way with an old pony, and she's pretty much given up, but she's still out first thing in the morning hunting for them. Now, walking in the cold fog, Luce doesn't even try to track the children. Short of a dropped sweater, all trace of them will have been erased by rain and snow. So she walks with nothing at all in her mind and tries to feel which way they might have gone. But she isn't the least bit telepathic. No vibrations reach her other than the general shimmer of sleeplessness. Many turnings present themselves, plenty of opportunities for choosing one faint passage over another. These mountains are no wilderness. They've been lived in for thousands of years. Many old nobodies long gone to earth left their marks on the land, subtle or not. Gameways stretching back beyond buffalo days to a distant ice age became Indian trails, little foot-wide hunting paths, and broad valley trails linking towns, each with its pyramid. Roads broad enough for helmeted Spaniards and their horses and scores of pigs and captives to make 20 miles a day in their traverse through here. 200 years farther on, many paths for horny colonial merchants and botanists and preachers coming to the highlands to make money and mixed-blood babies. And then American soldiers burning the villages so the townhouses at the tops of the pyramids became nothing more than a layer of charcoal. Some of those same roads became exile trails for the Cherokee, endless trails for the many who never reached the end. On the same mule tracks and wagon roads, the deluded gray boys traveled to war. Then sunken logging roads and skid paths from the end of the previous century, narrow gauge rail beds from the early clear-cut years of this century. Everywhere Luce looks, the ground lies webbed with lines of passage, a maze for the children to get lost inside and never come out. So you get out into the woods, and get far out into it, and you still run across those old marks on the land. It's hard to go anywhere, no matter how far you go into the woods beyond roads, and not find those old paths all the way back to those game trails that became Cherokee trails that became roads. Many of the roads through western North Carolina, the original roads, were on those Indian trails, and I think the Cherokee have had a project going for some time to map all that and make sure that relationship is understood, and just that this place is so crisscrossed with human inhabitation for 10,000 years. I always try to keep in mind when I'm working.
The last year that I spent in California was spent up in the Sierras and in a community, a rural community of people who are working to create a movement, what they call the bioregional movement. And by bioregion, they meant kind of a re-inhabitation, a rethinking, a reconsciousness about place and where we live and how we live in that place by informing ourselves and creating natural boundaries instead of state lines, imaginary state lines based on watersheds and the things that the indigenous people knew about and how they survived for thousands of years, living in balance and harmony with their surroundings for the most part. When I was living there, I was in the community. Gary Snyder lived there, and he was one of my heroes, and still remains one of my heroes, but very much involved with the environmental movement and conservation, protection of the environment in all kinds of different ways. Community, the importance of community in that process. But Charles and I were swapping stories a little earlier, and he reminded me of the story that actually brought me back to the mountains here from California. I was sitting in Gary Snyder's little Japanese designed house around the fire pit, and we were doing a little tea ceremony. He was all into the Zen Buddhism and the tea and all that. So when you're at Snyder's, you do what Snyder does, and it was tea time, and so we were sitting around having tea and talking, and he turned to me and he said, Thomas, you ought to go home. And, I really didn't know how to take that. I remembered as a boy when somebody would get mad at you, they'd chase you out of their yard, get out of my yard. And I kind of thought maybe he was telling me to get out of his yard. But it wasn't that at all. It was that the bioregional movement had really taken hold in the Northwest, and it was a viable movement. A lot of spokespeople was getting a lot of attention, and that he felt like that the whole idea, the ideology behind the bioregional movement needed to move out into the greater American landscape, and he felt like he had been to Western North Carolina. And he loved Joyce Kilmer and the Big Trees. He loved that place. And he said, Tom, you need to go home and spread the bioregional ethic to the people in Western North Carolina. So the timing was right. It was in the wintertime. It was approaching wintertime, which in the Sierras was very wet and cold, and I was living in a teepee. So I decided I would come back and live in Walt Johnson's little cabin, the same Walt Johnson that fed me red okra. He had died, and the cabin was just sitting there on a 250-acre mountain farm, and it had been offered to me anytime I wanted to come and use it. So I decided I would pass the winter back in the little cabin in the woods. And well, I did. I came back, and I'm still here. But I brought the bioregional ethic back with me, and we started a bioregional magazine called the Katua Journal, which went on for many years actually, and to try to educate, so to speak, people about the ideology of taking care of where you live and the importance of place. And basically, I've been involved in the environment and in environmental ethics and conservation in one way or another for the last 25 or more years, almost 30 years now. And because the place that I came back to wasn't the same place that I grew up in as a boy. It had changed. There were pollution problems, air pollution, water pollution, problems of development and overdevelopment, economic problems. Asheville had lost its great surge that it experienced earlier in the century, and people were working to try to revitalize Asheville, downtown Asheville, which is the Asheville we know today now. And so a lot of my writing has been about the environment. It's about in soul searching and trying to come to grips with how I can best work to help preserve and protect our environment. And I decided after spending time with all my friends in the 60s, marching and screaming and yelling and doing a lot of things we shouldn't have been doing probably, that I could be more effective through my writing than any other way. So I've been doing a lot of that, and a lot of the subject matter is about this place, and especially certain places that really have gotten my attention. I worked for a while on a project to protect and identify and protect Native American sacred sites in the southern Appalachians, where we were trying to work with the Cherokee and to preserve their special religious and cultural sites so that they wouldn't be infringed upon by development or the Forest Service logging or different things like that, to give them a voice in their own future and their destiny, whereas the land was concerned. So certain places reach out and grab you, just like certain characters and certain ideas. And just want to share with you one of those places. It's a place very close to here, just over the mountains. It's called Cataloochee Valley. And this is a poem. It's called Fall in Big Cataloochee Valley, 2010, an Ecology. And it's dedicated to Wayne Caldwell. For 150 years, only one road out of Big Catalooch, dug by hand, built on buffalo trails that crawl like a black snake on a rough-cut wall, up Half-Acre Ridge to Cove Creek Gap. In the valley, the small elk herds graze side by side with turkey and crows, sharing fields that Caldwell's cleared on the bottom's long shanty branch. Along Cataloochee Creek, the old church and schoolhouse stand alone like widowed ghosts, with open doors that answer the bugling of the bison-sized males like Sunday's bells. How many Caldwells, Messers, and Woodies lived here, hidden between these two old hills? How many elk, deer, bear, and beaver once called this place home? Now we drive by in large gas machines looking for graves, spoiling for a fight and the crash of antlers from the rutting bulls, going where the history of humans and the flora for ancient animals have forever been. From what the hell these eyes have seen, the subtle passing of the green. Do questions?
Questions? Yeah. Okay. We do take some questions if there are any. Yes, sir. Back there.
Can you hand you the mic?
Yes, Charles, I'd like to ask you about how an aspiring younger author from little old western North Carolina persuades a big publishing company to publish Cold Mountain.
You know, sometimes I wish I had a kind of tale of hardship to tell in that regard. You know, like it went to 40 publishers, and but my friend Kay Gibbons read it, and she called and said, I think I had 3/4 of it done, something like that. So she read what I had. And she called and said, I've just got a question. Do you want me to send it to my agent, FedEx or regular mail? Is it back on? No.
It's on.
Hello? There, it's back on. FedEx or regular mail? I said, regular mail is okay. And it was just pathetically simple. That's all I can say.
Just a note, if you haven't read it, you both might find interesting a book, The Scotch-Irish in America. I got a copy of it years ago.
Is that the title of it?
Yes.
Scotch-Irish in America.
It's about the movement of the Scotch-Irish down through the Appalachian chain. You both talked about oral tradition and about, at least for one of you, about your mother reading to you when you were young. Did you read books and stories when you were growing up?
Yeah, I was a voracious reader. I couldn't start fast enough because I saw my mother, reading from these books. And so I knew that all those great stories and all that magic was coming out of those books. And so my mother tells me now that I was reading by the time I was 5 and reciting some of the poems that she was telling me or, reading to me at night by 5 years old. So, and I'm a voracious reader. I don't read as much as my partner. She's really a reader. But I read an awful lot when I was younger. Everything I could get my hands on. So, yes.
There's a little book that came out recently called 27 Views of Asheville. And part of what I wrote about my remembrances of Asheville when I was a kid is coming over here and doing the book circuit of downtown Asheville. And it was like at some point, the book department of Bon Marché, that's where I bought my Hardy Boy books. Later, there was, where that restaurant Table is, down there in the dip. There was a newsstand there, and I bought dozens and dozens and dozens of comic books there. And then later, all the James Bond books. I loved those things. I read so much junk that some of my teachers told my parents, maybe you need to kind of aim him toward something a little loftier. But yeah, I read everything. We had a wonderful little Carnegie library in Andrews, and I think by the time I was 16, I'd read most of the books in that library. So, yeah.
You both described moving away and coming back. To what extent do you think one should, return to one's roots to write?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's probably pretty individual, but it was sort of necessary for me, I think, to come back here after having been gone for a while and really liking another part of the country. And I'd done a book about a kind of a trekking guide to Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, that kind of thing. And then to come back here, and it felt, I didn't take it for granted when I came back. And I think that was the biggest thing for me, is just to see it with fresh eyes instead of it feeling like this thing that you're used to and everything else is kind of exotic, but not here.
Charles and I were talking earlier about Thomas Wolfe being a big influence on both of us. And not long after I came back from California, of course, I came back with all these ideological illusions about changing people's minds about how they related to the land and politics and such. But I wrote a piece that was actually was published in the Asheville Citizen. They were doing a special section at that time, and they had some editors that were looking. It was the 50th anniversary, I think, of You Can't Go Home Again, and that they were making a big deal of it, all kinds of celebrations and everything. They were trying to create a poet laureate position and all kinds of things. So I wrote a piece called "You Must Go Home Again." You know, it was part of my soapbox that, you know, because that was part of the bioregional ethic, was for those who can or feel so compelled. It's important for those of us who have gone out into the world and learned some worldly lessons to bring it back home and share it with those folks who have stayed at home. And so it's a form of education in a way. So I really felt compelled to share what I had learned from going out into the world a bit and to bring it back home. And so my message was, you know, you must go home again, which obviously not everyone can do, or not everyone would want to, but for those people who move to another place that is not maybe where they grew up or was their the childhood homes, the whole idea of re-inhabitation was part of the bioregional ethic, and that means that wherever you move, no matter where it is, that you treat it as if it were your childhood home place, with that kind of respect and with the longer history of the cultures that preceded you there, and the time factor, the thousands of years, the millions of years that it took to create that beautiful place, hopefully. And to treat it with that respect and with the kind of conservation ethic that you would if you were going back to a place that you loved and grew up in. So.
Any more questions?
I'm just curious. Both of you have stressed your experiences in life affecting your writing, and some light disparaging of academics. Do you see a role for academia in producing good writers?
Well, I confess I'm a recovering PhD. I've been successfully away from it for nearly 20 years at this point, and I think I'm maintaining that pretty well. Now, I guess that I don't know. I got a PhD in literature, not writing, and so I don't really know what a MFA program, for example, is all about. I do know that the human tendency is to pull the outliers in, and I worry that that's part of the natural process of a writing workshop to regularize. So I'm suspicious without, I wouldn't say they're not of any value, but I'm suspicious of them. I do think for people who need, one of the things that an MFA program can do is provide this structure that mimics the writing, editing, critiquing, revising part of the job. And for people who need a structure, I think they can be helpful in that way.
Well, this is a real can of worms. I was never any good in school. But I basically agree with what Charles has said, but I would also add that I don't believe that you can teach somebody to be an artist. I believe that you can show them some great art and educate them about what might be considered great art and great techniques and history and all of that. But I don't believe you can teach somebody to be an artist. I think that if someone is going to be a writer, they're going to be there. They're going to get there anyway on their own. To be a great writer, I believe you have to read and you have to write. The more you read and the more you write, the better you become. And that's how you learn your craft. I don't think you need to go to school to learn how to be a writer. You just have to have a passion for writing. That's one part of it. The other part for me is that they're cranking out writers these days like factories, like it's a can of beans. And 2 years of coursework does not a writer make. So not only that, but it's flooding the market with so many writers that the real writers, may I use that term, can't get published or have a very, very hard time finding their audience. So it's there's problems on multiple levels, for me anyway. But it's not like we should get rid of the MFA programs. Maybe we should just change the way that they're taught and approached. And instead of leading these people on to believe that they're going to become great writers, taking 2 years worth of courses, I just don't think that's going to happen. In many cases, there are obviously exceptions, but.
Just speaking about Cold Mountain for a bit. Cold Mountain was very successful when it came out. It was made into a movie in North Carolina and Romania. The usual changes and things, but again, a very successful movie. Cold Mountain became a part of all the educational book magazine offerings, and probably has been taught many, many times in schools, colleges. How do you feel about a book like Cold Mountain being taught? And if you were going to teach it, how would you teach it?
Well, I mean, it's flattering that people find it useful in classes. I'll get like emails or something, which I don't really do email, but from like high school kids who are like, I've been assigned to write a paper about birds in Cold Mountain. What were you doing with the birds in Cold Mountain? My response is, you're on your own. I can't help you with that. I would find it interesting to be a fly on the wall in a classroom and hear what the instructor thinks is significant about the book and how I would respond to that. Because there's, I remember college and graduate school classes, a big percentage of the professors were just interested in the ideas of a book. And the ideas of a book seemed like just a part of it, and maybe not even that big a slice of the pie chart of a novel. I'm interested in the concrete world. I'm interested in the way people behave. I'm interested in what people are afraid of, what people desire and love. I'm interested in places and the look of things as the seasons change. All of that stuff that I try to use to build a fictional world. And so much of my interest is in that part of a book that I do get these thematic kinds of questions like, hey, there's this thing going on here, and then it pops up again here, and then it pops up here. Were you trying to establish a theme there? And frequently I think, well, it looks like maybe I was. But I do believe that if you immerse yourself enough in the culture, the physical world, the weather, all of those parts of the world that your characters inhabit, that those kinds of connections will arise naturally instead of being imposed.
To use Thomas's words, I think it's very obvious that we have two real writers. We do have both Thomas's and Charles's works for sale in the atrium, and they have graciously agreed to also sign books. If you have brought one that is well-worn and dog-eared, I'm sure they would be very willing to sign that as well. Once again, Thomas Ray Crowe, Charles Frazier, thank you.